Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 28, Mr. Frewen-Lord. Just a note, there is reference to suicide in this episode. Charles Frewen-Lord was married to my great-great-grandfather's cousin, and she was also niece to Elizabeth Ascot that featured in episode 6, Four Marriages. Her name was also Elizabeth Ascot. Elizabeth Ann Ascot was the daughter of Thomas Ascot and his wife Emma Levy, and Thomas was covered in episode 6. Elizabeth was born in Prahran, Victoria on the 19th of September 1854 and baptised on the 8th of October. By 1876, when Elizabeth was 12, her father left the family. She married Charles Frewen-Lord at the age of 16 in Victoria in 1870, and Charles was 23. Charles was born in Sandwell, Cumberland, England on the 6th of May 1847. His father William was a reverend, and he served as a reverend on the ship Sacramento that took the family to Melbourne in 1853. Charles's father William also had to act as surgeon on the ship when the surgeon died en route. On the 29th of April 1853, the Melbourne Morning Herald outlined the arrival of the Sacramento into Port Phillip Bay. It's titled Wreck at the Heads. The barque, Sacramento, Holmes Master from London, with 250 government immigrants, arrived off the Heads yesterday. About 3 a.m, the ship struck upon Point Lonsdale Reef, about 1 mile from shore and 4 miles from the lighthouse. The longboat, lifeboat and 2 smaller boats were immediately hoisted out and the landing of the immigrants commenced. Some were taken to the shore and others landed temporarily on the reef. The news was brought to Geelong yesterday afternoon by Reverend Mr. Lord, chaplain to the Sacramento. When he left the pilot station yesterday morning at 9, the boats were busily engaged in landing the immigrants, but a heavy surf was running. The process was necessarily slow, and even with the weather remaining favourable, it would occupy the greater portion of yesterday to land them all. The condition of some of the poor creatures crowding into the boats, many of them in their night dresses only, was truly pitiable. From the ship's position, she's not likely to be got off, and in the meantime, the immigrants' luggage and cargo is in jeopardy. The vessel has most likely already gone to pieces. The Reverend Mr. Lord said that the greatest kindness was shown by Captain Preston, Mr. Foy and the pilots, and also by Mrs. Dodd, who resides near the station. The Sacramento left London on the 22nd of December and was detained by stress of weather in the Downs for nearly a month. About 10 days after leaving, the surgeon died of an infection of the throat. Several other deaths had occurred, chiefly of infants. On the death of the surgeon, Mr. Lord acted in his stead and was so far fortunate that only one death, an infant, occurred subsequently. Several vessels passed up the Western Channel yesterday, so that the news of the wreck will have reached the government. Our local immigration agent will proceed overland this morning with supplies of comforts for those who have landed. And on the 5th of May, so a week later, it was mentioned in the paper that the arrival of the government agent with provisions and other comforts was a most acceptable relief. Steps were immediately taken to find out the scattered and the lost, which was successful, and on the arrival of the Euphrasia from Melbourne, they safely embarked and were conveyed to Melbourne. So quite a dramatic start to Charles's arrival as a child in Australia. There was a collection advertised in the Melbourne newspapers to assist William and his family setting up in Victoria as they'd lost everything on the wreck of the ship. And there was record of William presiding over marriage services in his first couple of months in Melbourne. But then after that, Charles's father William vanished. So in 1853, the year they arrived, his father William disappeared. And there is an article in December 1866 in the Melbourne Argus. William Frewen-Lord, £10 reward. The above reward will be paid to any person who shall give legal evidence of the existence and present address, or, if dead, of the death of William Frewen-Lord, late of Melbourne, Victoria, who left his home for the Plenty, last heard of in the month of November 1853. application to be made to, and there is no death record of William Frewen-Lord, and there is no follow-up article stating what had befallen William Frewen-Lord. Family members think that he may have gone to the plenty as part of the gold rush, and so whether something awry happened, but the family did not hear of William again. In 1867, Charles is recorded as working as an accountant in Chiltern, Victoria. And in June of 1867, there was a council meeting, and Charles had sent a letter directly to Councillor McLaughlin, stirring up a little bit of trouble. And it says here that Councillor McLaughlin said before any business was done, he would bring before the council a notice he had received from a person signing himself Charles Frewen-Lord, generally considered a loafer by the public, threatening Councillor McLaughlin with legal proceedings if he took seat at the council. So interesting how Councillor McLaughlin didn't hold back in describing Charles in not such a favourable manner. On the 2nd of August 1870, Charles was charged with attempted suicide in El Dorado. In those days, if you attempted suicide, it was classed as an offence and you could be jailed for it. Now, this was the year that he also married Elizabeth Ascot, so I'm not sure whether Elizabeth and Charles were newly married or they were yet to marry at this time. On the 23rd of July 1870, in the Ovens and Murray Advertiser, Beechworth, it was reported, there is a rumour current last night that Mr. Charles Lord, accountant, had taken an overdose of laudanum. For once rumour proved to be correct. I have not been able to gather with any degree of certainty the exact circumstances by which Mr. Lord's life was imperilled. Fortunately, though, the prompt remedies used, he is now considered out of danger. It is possible the case will be inquired into at the police court tomorrow. Laudanum was an opiate that was used quite widely for pain relief. However, it was a medicine that you had to be very, very careful with. Being obviously based on what we would consider today as heroin, it could very well be an addictive medicine, but also you could easily overdose. In the newspaper, the case was outlined. El Dorado Police Court, Friday, July 29. Attempted suicide. Charles Lord was charged with attempted suicide. Mr. O'Donnell from the defence pleaded that his client was under the influence of drink at the time the attempt was made. Elizabeth and Charles had 3 boys, one in 1871 that was presumably stillborn as it was unnamed, one in 1872 they called Charles Henry Frewen-Lord, he lived until 4, and Charles Ascot Frewen-Lord, who was born and died in 1874. Unfortunately, the union had no children that survived into adulthood. By February 1873, Charles was working in Wangaratta as a law clerk for John Norton's solicitors. By 1874, a court case popped up stating that Charles was in default distress. A man took him to court for goods and services that weren't paid for, and Charles could only pay a very small amount of what was owed. In 1881, a child, Harriet Lord, was born in Queensland, as well as a child, Charles Lord, in Barcaldine, Queensland in 1888. The father was listed as Charles Lord on both birth certificates and the mother, Jane Hamilton Fernandez. This is the first time we get a clue that Charles looks like he has made his way to Queensland. In the paper The Morning Bulletin on Friday the 18th of May 1888, on Thursday, before the PM, C.F. Lord, a bush lawyer, was fined 10 shillings or 24 hours imprisonment for being drunk. He was subsequently charged with using threatening language in a public place. From the evidence, it seems the defendant was very rowdy in Emerson's hotel, and upon the landlord threatening to send for the police, Lord drew a knife and threatened to do for Emerson and smash all the furniture. For this, he was fined 60 shillings or 1 month's imprisonment. Lord was also fined 60 shillings or a month's imprisonment for using obscene language. In October 1889, a marriage occurred between Charles Frewen-Lord and Jane Hamilton Fernandez. Charles was 41 and Jane 25, and Charles listed himself as a widower on the marriage certificate, quite interestingly, and his occupation a contractor. In the Queenslander on the 9th of November 1889, two men named C. Lord and F. Anderson, who had been engaged in fencing for Mr. Emerson at a paddock near Barcaldine, had a very narrow escape from death by lightning on Saturday afternoon during a storm. After dinner, they were rolling up their swags at their camping place, consisting of 2 sheets of iron, when the lightning struck the iron. Lord was stunned for a time, and when he came to, found Anderson lying unconscious, his appearance leading him to think his mate was killed. After a time, both men recovered and walked into town, but suffered from pains in the head, and Anderson had some fits during the evening. The men are now none the worse for the accident, and Dr. Willis is attending to them. In July 1893, there was an article that mentioned that Charles was banned from drinking alcohol at any establishment in Barcaldine by the magistrate for a period of 6 months. So it's clear at this point that his earlier troubles when he was back in Chiltern and El Dorado and Wangaratta area were due to alcohol, and it seems that it's followed him to Queensland. In July 1902, Charles changes his occupation slightly and is now a citrus farmer. In the Queenslander on the 12th of July 1902, it was mentioned that 10 of the Seville oranges weighing 10 pounds on one spray, grown by Mr. C. F. Lord of Barcaldine, who also grew the Lisbon lemons and round oranges. Charles and Jane had 13 children together, 11 of them survived childhood, and they lived in Barcaldine until Charles was in his mid-60s when they moved to Rockhampton in Queensland. Charles died in Rockhampton in 1918, aged 70. When Charles stated he was a widower when marrying Jane Fernandez in 1889, Elizabeth was still very much alive, but she'd also married herself. Elizabeth married Henry Osborne in Clunes on the 10th of February 1875. So it could have very likely have been actually before Charles left for Queensland. They were only married 14 months when Henry was killed in a mining accident. They had one daughter, Elizabeth, that was born in 1876. Elizabeth didn't marry. She moved to Fremantle, Western Australia in 1902 and returned to Victoria by 1917, where she died at Cheltenham, aged 41. Elizabeth then married Richard Tresize, an Englishman who was 11 years older than her. Elizabeth was only 22, but she was on to her third marriage, which occurred in Clunes in March 1877. Richard was a grocer. They had 10 children together, all of which survived childhood. By 1892, they had moved to Brunswick. Richard died in 1892, aged only 49, leaving Elizabeth with a large young family, including a 2-month-old baby. Elizabeth continued running the grocers herself. There was an ad in 1897 saying Mrs. E. Tresize, cash grocer, greengrocer and confectioner in Tinning Street, Brunswick. Elizabeth died as well at the age of 49 in a buggy accident on the 17th of September 1904. Her youngest child, Nellie, was only 12. There's an article outlining the incident called A Brunswick Fatality. Mrs. Elizabeth Tresize of Tinning Street, Brunswick, was thrown out of a pony cart in Elizabeth Street on the 7th and died in the Melbourne hospital early on Saturday morning from the injuries received. An inquest occurred. Mrs. Tresize, who had been ill in bed for a considerable time, had on that day ventured out for the first time. While the pony cart was standing near the sidewalk in Elizabeth Street, it was struck and overturned by a passing harvester drawn at the tail of a lorry. The lady was thrown onto her head and sustained concussion of the brain. Alfred Frederick Cortis, Inspector of Hackney Carriages, stated that he saw the accident occur at the west ride of Elizabeth Street near Burke Street and opposite the House of Commons Hotel at 1:45 p.m. on the 7th. There was a lorry on the west side of the street to which a harvester was attached, and on the off side of the lorry a sulky. Witness told the driver not to move until he had cleared the road. Presently, when the traffic had cleared, the witness said, "Now you can go." The driver of the lorry started his horse, and a moment later the witness heard a shout. Looking round, the witness saw that the iron spike which stuck out from the right side of the harvester was caught in the near wheel of the sulky. The pony attached to the sulky swerved away from the harvester towards the footpath, thereby bringing the back of the sulky over the drum of the harvester, and the lorry moving overturned the sulky and threw the pony down. In the meantime, the driver of the lorry tried to pull up his horse. Witness went to the pony's head and held it. When the sulky was overturned, the two ladies were thrown out. The driver of the lorry was sober. Mr. Hickford: how far was the spike projecting? About 1 foot. Mrs. Sophia Allen gave evidence. The harvester struck the back of the sulky and threw the deceased out. She fainted and was carried onto the footpath. She was at that time in very poor health. The sulky was not moving at the time of the accident. Harrison Hill lorry driver, residing at Canning Street, North Carlton, also gave evidence. After a patient inquiry, the coroner found that on the 17th, at the Melbourne Hospital, the deceased Elizabeth Tresize died from bronchopneumonia due to a low condition of health, supervening on previous illness and on the shock resulting from the accidental fall from a vehicle in Elizabeth Street, Melbourne, on the 7th. Out of all of the children that Richard and Elizabeth had, 2 of her children died young. The first child, Richard, he was a chauffeur and he was living at the Earl of Zetland Hotel in Adelaide, and quite a few of Elizabeth and Richard's children did move to Adelaide. He was married with a daughter who was only born in May 1915, when on the 13th of September 1915 he was involved in an accident. He was admitted to the Adelaide Hospital with compound fractures of both legs and shock from when the car he was driving collided with the train near McLaren Vale. He and 2 others that he was driving were thrown out of the vehicle, and one of them also died. And there was an inquest into the tragedy, and the article states, Railway Crossings, a sweeping condemnation, Wollonga Road tragedy. A second hearing of the inquest concerning the death of Richard Henry Tresize, who met his death as the result of a collision between the motor he was driving and a train at the second crossing on Wollonga Road on September 13th, was conducted at the Adelaide Local Court on Friday morning. Mr. Nesbitt represented Mrs. Tresize, the wife of the deceased chauffeur. The inquest began on September 16th, when the testimonies of Morris John Sheenan, who gave evidence of identification, and Dr. E.A. Geimer, who attended the deceased on his admission to the Adelaide Hospital, was taken, but an adjournment was found necessary owing to the indisposition of Mr. Mazu, the third occupant of the car at the time of the accident. On the resumption of proceedings, the acting coroner presided. A photograph of the fatal crossing was produced by the Crown Law Department. And then Leon Edmund Mazur Vigneron of McGill submitted evidence of the drive to Tachachilla on the 13th of September with the late Mrs. Luke and Mr. Tresize, and the return journey, which began about 2:30 p.m. Witness and Mrs. Luke occupied the back seat and the deceased Tresize drove. The road led downhill to the crossing. Mrs. Luke said, "Be very careful of the railway line," adding that she wished to stop at a house a little beyond the cutting. The car travelled at about 10 to 12 miles an hour. When the car was 4 or 5 yards from the Meadows, Mrs. Lake exclaimed, "Here's the train." He turned towards her and never saw it. The next thing he remembered was a blow on the right of the head. He heard a tremendous crash and roar, and then remembered no more until he found himself lying on the road with the train at a standstill in front of him. Mrs. Luke lay a little distance away. He was fully conscious and said, "I'm done for." The railway officials then arrived on the scene and placed the 3 occupants of the car in the train, and they subsequently were brought to Adelaide. He heard no whistle when approaching the crossing. The driver of the car was proceeding carefully and was watchful of the crossing. It was raining at the time and a strong wind blew. In reply to Mr. Nesbitt, the witness said that the slope leading to the crossing was bad all the way to the metals, and there was a hedge which obscured the line from the direction in which the car travelled. Mr. Nesbitt asked, "Do you think the crossing is reasonably safe for motors or other vehicles?" And the witness said, "I don't think so." Mrs. Luke was very nervous in the car and told Tresize to be very careful several times. "Did you look for the train at the top of the hill?" And he answered, "Yes, I failed to see it, nor did I see any smoke." "What was the first intimation you had of the approach of the train?" Mrs. Luke's exclamation. "Did Mrs. Luke make any remark about the crossing after the accident?" "Yes, after saying she knew she was going to die, she exclaimed, 'Oh, that crossing.'" Hugh Byrne of South Road, Keswick, said he was an engine driver employed in the South Australian Railways. He drove the Wollonga passenger train that left McLaren Vale on the September the 13th. He sounded a whistle when approaching what is known as the third crossing, about 300 or 400 yards before reaching the road where the accident occurred. At the time, he had a clear view of the road crossing. which he retained until within 20 yards of it. He then noticed a motor car approaching rapidly on the left. He applied the brake. Instantly something collided with the engine, striking the side of the cowcatcher, and he noticed flames and the smell of benzene. The train came to a standstill about 80 yards past the road, and while witnesses attended to his engine, which needed repairs, the fireman returned to assist the occupants of the car. He found that the motor car was on fire. It prevented the train from proceeding until the flames were extinguished. In answer to Mr. Nesbitt, the witness said that when he first saw the motor car, it was too late to avoid a collision. He was on the lookout for passing vehicles, but the hedge would probably block his view. At that time, he had worked up full speed and was travelling 25 miles an hour at the time of the collision. The evidence had established the fact that the driver of the train had challenged the crossing by sounding the whistle and that he kept a lookout. The weather conditions were unfavourable, however. The verdict would be that the deceased came to his death at the Adelaide Hospital on the 13th of September from shock, following upon injuries received as a result of an accidental collision between a motor car and a train near McLaren Vale on the same day. The second child, Joseph Arthur Tresize, he was the second youngest of the family, and he was born in Clunes in 1880. He was 2 when his father died and 14 when his mother died. He married Ellen Lucinda Martin in 1912 when he was 22. He was an engineer living at Albert Park when he enlisted in World War I in June 1915, and he was part of the 13th Light Horse Regiment. He was taken on strength into France on the 7th of July 1916. He was admitted to hospital with influenza on the 1st of September 1916. He was gassed on the 1st of November 1917 and then shell gassed only 2 weeks later. He was admitted to hospital again with influenza on the 4th of February 1919 and died in hospital on the 9th of February 1919, aged 29. And the Army sent a letter to his wife. It says, "Dear Madam, with reference to the report of the regrettable loss of your husband, the late number 934, Lance Corporal J.A. Tresize, 13th Australian Light Horse Regiment, I am now in receipt of advice from above that he was admitted to the 3rd Australian Auxiliary Hospital, Dartford, England, on the 4th of February 1919, suffering from influenza and dangerously ill, when he died on the 9th. He was buried on the 13th of February 1919 in an Australian military burial ground at Brookwood, England, grave number 182903, consecrated ground by the chaplain Reverend C.S. Richmond, Church of England, officiating. The deceased soldier was accorded a full military funeral, firing party, bugler and pallbearers being in attendance. The coffin, a good polished elm, was draped with the Australian flag and conveyed to the graveside where the last post was sounded. Administrative headquarters AIF London were represented at the funeral. The grave will be turfed and an oak cross erected by the AIF London. The utmost care and attention is being devoted where possible to the graves of our soldiers. It is understood that photographs are being taken as soon as it is possible, and they will be transmitted to the next of kin when available. Those additional details are furnished by direction, it being the policy of the department to forward all information received in connection with the deaths of members of the AIF. So Elizabeth Ann Ascot certainly didn't have an easy life. 3 marriages by 22. She did, in the end, it seems she found a man that she had a large family with and was able to see that family flourish, and those family have descendants today.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes